So, in
Perfect.
celebration of Juneteenth, we wanted to speak with someone who has lived and led a life in the oncology space that we think has made a huge difference in terms of how we view each other, but particularly in the clinical trial space and also in the workforce in medical oncology, ensuring that maybe the workforce looks like the patients who have cancer who are being cared for. And we know that you have had many successes, but I suspect you also have had some challenges. So we want you to share with us your successes and your challenges and how you see this field moving forward.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and thank you for what you and your organization are committed to and what you're doing. Um, I really like the way you frame that because as we talk about clinical trials, I do think historically it has had some challenges. And interestingly enough, while the story some tell is that the historical challenges of not getting rural communities or minorities onto clinical trials is really with the rural and the minority communities. That old thing that it's not that at-risk communities are hard to get, they're just that they're hardly reached. And I'm going to take the framework that what we've been doing, particularly over the last 10 years or so, is changing first the conversation that a clinical trial in 2026 is not a clinical trial of 1936. Now,
Yes.
what do I mean by that? Today, we have the issue that a clinical trial today is exactly what an exceptional health system should offer when the standard of care has been reached. In other words, when you have reached the end of the road and our patients in some of our at-risk communities have gotten, quote, the standard of care. No, arguably, let's even put in there the best standard of care. The standard is actually the offering of access to clinical trials.
Yeah,
That language
that's so true.
that language has to change not only within our communities, but that language has to change with us. And so when people say, well, why are we having so many much problems with, getting people on the clinical trials? I sort of say, well, I go, when you pointing one finger, you got three pointing back. I think that's the old saying. I go, what are we contributing? First of all, we don't even, as W.B. Yeats said once famously, I think, speak and think like the wisest of men and women, but communicate in the language of the people. We act as if we are saying crazy things to our communities. In fact, I stopped and will stop everybody from talking about people being scientifically illiterate or health illiterate. I know what illiterate is. There's a difference between being illiterate and being unaware. Illiterate is when my father, who, speaking during Juneteenth time, it just makes me a little bit emotional. My dad grew up as a sharecropper, was taken out of school to help sharecrop, and ultimately was robbed of the ability to read. Now, when he could pick up a book and it wouldn't help, he would have just, I don't understand what, and people could explain it. He didn't know how to read. You know what this man did? He wound up going to night classes. What he didn't tell me was he was taking me to night classes with it. And his air cover was he was taking me to help be a better reader. What it turned out was that I was being his mentor and helping him to learn how to read. That man read the newspaper once he figured it out. He read the newspaper every single day up until the day that literally the day of his death. So when people say to me, people are health illiterate, I go, what do you mean by that? Because they're not illiterate. Once you're able to explain, people understand. What they are is unaware. So we need to get rid of that language, number one. Number two is that, it's like Charlie Wilson. Most of the time when I was telling people that I was at middle school dances and I had a friend who could always get dance. I mean, he's danced with everybody. Then it was me. I was up against the wall and most of that was because I was afraid to ask because I was making the assumption that people would say no. Or when I went and got the courage up, I sounded crazy. I would have probably told myself, I don't want to dance with you. And that's what we are in the health field. Nadine Baird and others have actually also figured out that it's not that minorities don't want to get on clinical trials, i.e., not experimentation, but an extension of access to better health care. It's they'll never ask. And then the health providers and the systems come up with multiple ways of these stories of why they won't, almost like in middle school when you're asked to dance and you come up with the reason why every single person in that building was going to figure out how to tell you no before they told you no. And then second is the message. Charlie Wilson, I always want to say I love Charlie Wilson because, he had a way of just talking and connecting. We think that facts are the only things as opposed to connecting with people. And the science of communication, I think, is going to mandate that we move forward and that we put the mirror up on ourselves and recognize that we are a major contributor, i.e., the health system and the folks within it. We've been a major impediment to getting people on the clinical trials. So some of the good things we're changing the language. Some of the good things we're doing, I have a program in which we're finally training clinical trialists, not only in the regulatory, not only in the implementation science, not only in the context of the design, but there's a program where we put as equal emphasis on the science of outreach and engagement. And that by bringing the science of outreach and engagement with the traditional sciences of clinical trialism, we've been able to demonstrate that the people that we've trained are able to put more rural communities, more at-risk communities on the trial compared to their counterparts. And so I think there's a future ahead. It's just going to take some work.
Thank you so much. But I want you to talk a little bit more about this program because I think that's a program that might make a difference. Or maybe that's even too soft. That's a program that will make a difference in the workforce. It's a very important program. And I know you're being modest talking about it. This is a program that's named after you. So talk to us about how a Dr. Winn is able to generate enough scholarships to train future scientists for our community. Tell us your story from that perspective.
Yeah. So, what I always love about life, and my grandmother who's 99, keeps me grounded, is that she always says, if you're going to do something big, you ain't going to do it alone. But it does take one person with a good idea to be other people around them to make it happen.
Yes.
So this is a story of me recognizing that there was a problem. There's a national problem. The national problem is that uh, we don't have enough access to minorities on the clinical trials. Now, I said that different in the sense of, well, you don't have enough minorities on trials. Well, we don't have the access for those minorities to get on those trials and make the decisions whether they want to be on it or not. I also recognize that was true about rural communities. And then I had an idea once, and it literally comes out of the power of communities. I went somewhere once, and this is how the idea kind of percolated. And I was giving a talk, and I was with one of the faith-based leaders. And then I told him about clinical trials. I said, well, the clinical trial is not so much a trial as it is an extension. Hey, I go, when all other options have gone run out, you want to be, I go, there's women right now walking around 15 years, 18 years, running 18 years out of their therapy with then HER2 new, the new treatments that they have for breast cancer. I go, now imagine, that we have communities that are getting those access to that and getting the benefits of that and communities that don't. I go, listen, it ain't about experimentation. It's about giving you hope. Either something's going to work for you today or hope is going to work for somebody tomorrow. And you know what he said? He goes, well, man, if y'all just said that. And it was an aha moment. It was, wait a minute. So we have all these smart people who essentially are unaware, i.e., to use their word, illiterate, of how to really connect with communities. And then it came to me that it didn't have to be. It turned out that it's almost like this is what I always sort of said somebody with Reese's peanut butter. That it must have been brilliant. Say, I like chocolate, I like peanut butter. How do I put them together? This was one of those moments where I said, well, it's clear that clinical trials are actually important. In fact, you and I know 34% fewer Americans since 1991 are dying from cancer. That's just not because they're eating more kale and drinking more carrot juice. It just, it's not. But what I found out with that line of thinking from faith-based leaders, by the way, so I'm telling you all the story about how I got to this program. It's called the Winn
Yes.
CDA, but it's a team. Faith-based leaders from the beginning actually pointed out Why can't you all just talk in language that can be understood? It dawned on me that that wasn't just something that's naturally gifted, that's a skill set. It's a skill set we don't teach, and it's a skill set that in many cases has been undervalued. And I'm using that word deliberately, undervalued. So I actually had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was, what if we had a workforce that didn't exist, that had not just outreach and engagement over to one side, and then the clinical trials, traditional of regulatory design and implementation on the other side? What if we trained a workforce and we brought those together? My hypothesis was, if we had a workforce that knew that the difficulty of getting a miracle molecule to become a medicine, and we trained them into the outreach and engagement sciences, that by training that workforce, we'd have better outcomes. That was my hypothesis, that
Wow.
a different type of training of, yes, you need regulatory, yes, you need design, yes, you need high impact trials, but equally important, you need to understand the science of connectedness, the science of outreach, the science of engagement, because it's not just some sort of thing that we go into neighborhoods and we do outreach and engagement. Come on. The reality is, just because there are people who undervalue that science don't mean that I undervalue it. It's almost like blues and jazz. At some point, people also wanted to undervalue that, and they would say, well, the real classical music is really that shows the intelligence. But as we started breaking it down, we understood the genius of Thelonious Monk. We understood the genius of Duke Ellington. And in fact, it was elevated. That is the same feeling I had with the elevation of the science of outreach and engagement today. There's been a 40-year history around this. There are frameworks around this, and yet we continue to undervalue it. So my attitude was, let's combine it. And the reality is, we have a program now called the Winn Career Development Award that is a very competitive program, about 50 to 60 people a year. This is our 5th year, so we now have 300 people plus that have been part of the program, who literally are actually not making this, it's no longer theoretical, it is reality, which we now have a cohort of now 5. This is our 5th cohort of people who are learning what happens when you're able to combine the traditional ideas of clinical trials with an additional skill set of communication with outreach and engagement, that not only do you get more people onto trials, not only do you get more minorities and more rural communities onto trials, but you get people who actually are in those communities who are not only much more accepting of trials, but we become the best ambassadors we have of going out to communities that are saying, you do know that this access to trial stuff isn't so much an experimenting on you as it is giving you access to hope. So that program was sponsored by Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation, who took a chance on this. Now, reality, it was supposed to be a pilot grant, but sometime after George Floyd, it became obvious that we wanted to do something more. So John DeMonte, then, who was the president of the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation, and I discussed this. He gave me a phone call that says, Rob, I know we talked about doing this as a small pilot, but what about a national program? What do you think you could do with that? And literally, my grandfather always used to say, my dad, they said, now look, if somebody call you with some money, the very first thing you say is yes. And he goes, the very next thing you got to do is, well, how you gonna make it? How you gonna spend the money and make it work? So I got a team together. It took a team, then Bristol Myers Squibb, but it took the American Association of Cancer Research, which Marge Foti. It took the folks over at ASCO and a handful of us, and then a couple people just at universities. Dr. Joy Jones was actually also a part of that original group, and we figured it out. And with the help of the Bristol Myers Squibb folk foundation, and then Gilead and Amgen and Genentech, we've now got a real national program that allows us to really give people, I think, access to a new workforce that had not existed before, of clinical trialists who also are skilled in the context of outreach and engagement and connectedness with communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Sam, I'm sure you have a question. Otherwise, I'll keep talking to Dr. Winn. And we have Sam Ranger, Chief Program Officer, and Maya Birhiray, Medical Science Liaison. So go on, Sam.
Yeah, I think Maya has a better follow-up for this one specifically. Yes. So Dr. Winn, talking more about the program and the professionals that you've been engaging in giving that kind of training, it's very obvious the impact that can have on the communities and on the patients. But I want to know a little bit more about what feedback you've gotten from the professionals after going through this training and how it's impacted them as liaisons, as community engagement leaders, and things like that.
You know what the best is that when you get the feedback from the program of not only how it has changed their own individual lives, many of these people have gone on to actually be able to find fruitful careers in writing about the kind of things that they've been doing and finding that there is not only an audience, but there's new knowledge to be put forward and that they're the experts in it. It's been great on an individual level where people said to me, I had an idea and no one would listen because, it just didn't fit into a really nice package. But your ability to actually understand that this trial was important, but also the science of engagement and what I was going to do to get more people onto trials was actually also important, was a first. And thank you. But you know what the best was? Is that many of these people now are leaders within, honestly, which was crazy. I never actually expected that it would happen this soon. Many of these people are influencers in their own institution. We now have people that are through this program that are now actually getting traditionally very conservative programs when it comes to clinical trials to expand and enhance their ability to think that they can get more people on the trials because they now are the voices within these institutions. We have people who, for example, I'm thinking about one of my guys, scholars that came through that actually took what I thought was an impossible task. Now, when he came to me initially with the idea, I was like, right on. It was almost like when Jesse Jackson was running for president. You would just like, all you had to say is run, Jesse, run. You're like, I don't know if you're going to win, but run. I got you, run. Um, and so when this person came to me with an ideal of saying, I want to put clinical trials in an area that has none now, I scratched my head and said, well, how are you really going to do that? You know what he said to me? He goes, I learned, Dr. Wynn, throughout the program how to do it because that's what you were doing all the time. You were finally giving me a network that didn't exist. And so to put together these clinical trials, he goes, by the end of my training, I now knew how not just a network was a Rolodex of people you knew, but how to leverage the network for action. And he goes, so at the end of that, he goes, Dr. Wynn, he goes, I know there was no doubt in your mind that you didn't think I was going to get it done. I had to say, you right. You're right. But in my head, I was like, I don't really know how, but okay, let's give you the tools. What I'm also learning by that is that we're bringing in really brilliant, talented people that under normal circumstances wouldn't be part of the traditional sort of frameworks who are coming in and actually being enabled uh, with enhanced tools within their kit to build things that we weren't. I only say this story because this person really brought it to fruition, and that there was a community in which he was actually working in where there was zero trials, zero. He now has gotten, I think he says, upward to almost 100 trials.
Wow.
Now it took a few years,
Yes.
but what I learned from that was that this program was not only giving people information, it was also doing something that I had not counted on, but should have. It's given people a community, a network of other activists, if you would, who are really believe that people should have access to clinical trials. And so these young folk are using that full breadth of the network to say, hey, can you help me out with this piece? Can you actually, do you know anybody who would actually be hireable for this? What else would I have to do? Hey, I don't have this piece here. Could I actually farm this piece out? They're doing it and they're making it happen. And so if I sound excited, I'm trying to tamper down my excitement
Yes.
because
Please don't.
what's happened is that these people have gone beyond my wildest dreams of what is possible. And we see that the folks that have come out of this program are making big impacts. in rural communities, big impacts in academic communities, and big impacts in just communities at large. The fun part about this is that now many are thinking about the next realm, that they're like, well, level up, let's go, because this shouldn't be something that's unique. Two of my scholars actually sort of said, Dr. Winn, this makes no sense why this is the standard for the country and around the world. By the way, I know global is not a great term now, but when you think about just humanity as people, if we're actually learning how to do things better here, there will come a time where we need to be able to reach across the pond and other things to work with other folks in other communities, maybe even outside the United States, so that everyone benefits from our knowledge. So that's kind of where things are right now.
Thank
Wow.
you. Yeah, I mean,
Maya, does
yes.
that inspire you? Maybe one day
It,
you'll become a Winn scholar yourself. So Maya
yes,
is
I
a
mean,
medical student, and she's at IU here, and maybe one day she'll become a Winn scholar herself.
That's
yes,
awesome.
definitely. I mean, just incredibly inspiring. I've just been really, I was very impressed by the program before, but just hearing you talk about it, and how it came to fruition has just been
Well,
really
well,
powerful.
sis, look, there's another arm of this, which was for our medical students to give them early exposure to clinical trials, not so that they're aware of clinical trials, but they understand how clinical trials are integrated and ultimately part of the training they get when they talk about wanting to make people better. So we do have it's called the SIP program. You have the Career Development Award, and then you have the SIP program, and both of those components were absolutely right from ground zero important to me. Initially, the program, you'll get a kick out of this, Doc. So when I actually created this program, it was right the small pilot. It was supposed to be so that the medical students would be trained by some of the scholars, and that both the medical students and the scholars would actually have an ultimate mentor, and that mentor would be someone from the community. And then COVID happened. And so then we had to kind of pivot. And so the program took a little bit of a change, but ultimately that whole alignment of community, our faculty, and our students being aligned and being in a place where they can talk and discuss and work together for all of our good is still a core piece of this program.
Sam?
That's fantastic to hear. And kind of thinking about all of these things that you've been talking about, the changing the language around things like health literacy, training clinical trial staff, training medical students, just increasing knowledge as a whole, working with leaders in the community. What are some other steps that you've seen or that you're thinking about for the general oncology clinic? What are things that people in oncology can be doing to help achieve and work with some of these goals that you're working on?
Yeah, I think just in general in oncology, I think that as an oncologist, practicing oncologist now, 1976, 1986, you would think about trials as being something that was very academic and maybe good, but not necessary. And I understand when it comes to primary care and it comes to our everyday work, our number one thing is to deliver the standard of care. And in fact, understanding that in the last 30 some odd years since 1991. Let's think about it. 34% fewer people are dying from cancer. Why? That's because you've actually had our national team. And I mean this is that we usually see a commercial and we see a patient, and they usually would say something like, I wouldn't be here were it not for my doctor or for this drug. I always sort of tell people that that's only such a piece of the story. You know, we've been telling the stories as oncologists and as cancer care folk, not a complete story, which means that how can our communities fully embrace who we are and what we do when we only give them a partial story? Here's the real story. I wish that same commercial had a different ending, which says, I am so glad that my doctor had an opportunity to be able to give me this life-saving medicine so that I can be here with my daughter for her wedding. But I also want to thank the person who came up with the idea, the scientific idea, which I don't even understand what it is, but I know that that scientific idea was supported by, NCI, NIH, and our academic medical centers. I understand that once that idea was seen to be valid, it needed to be scaled. And then it was scaled by a group of teammates and other people that I don't know their names, but I want to thank them. They were able to allow me to scale this drug up in a way that it was now available to folks like me and my doctor. I also want to thank the doctor, the nurses, and everybody that allowed to take the time to understand that as a result of somebody in some sort of space, in some sort of wet laboratory or on a computer, figuring out that there was a new molecule that become a miracle medicine, and the people that are involved with scaling that up allowed access to that drug for me to have my doctor be able to take it off the shelf and use it for me. So yes, I want to thank my doctor, but I really want to thank our national team for working together. This concept of one team with one fight is really shown in this national team of cancer fighters. I actually want to push us to getting from a more fragmented state of mind to a more united state of mind. In fact, I think that some things that contribute to burnout with our physicians is that they feel that they're all alone. Our nurses feel like we're fighting this battle alone. But when you understand that the drug you just got, the immunotherapy drug or the molecular targeted therapy drug or the new vaccine you got, didn't just kind of fall out of the sky or someone found it on their way walking down the river, that became an issue of it got discovered because of us. Occasionally, even because of conversation that happens in the community that gets one of your scientists thinking, I need to solve that problem. We need to stop talking about the me and start talking about the we, the collective we. And I actually think if there was anything in oncology that I would like to change it in cancer field, I would actually like to get us back to thinking about us being the national team that fights cancer. I also would say that we have to be better about, and I don't usually, quote Kanye West too much, but there is one thing he said once where he, 1.0, y'all, like he said, sometimes you can get caught into focusing on what you're lacking so much that you don't understand what you're packing. We can get into this all of what we don't have as opposed to what we do, so that ultimately you feel that even when you're making progress, you feel like you're going backwards. We need to be careful about the language, particularly in the field of medicine. So, what would I like? I think that I have always sort of said, what if the dream team or the 1980s hockey team, whatever you want, but what if the dream team got together and it was a tight game, and all of a sudden Michael Jordan hits the 3-pointer and they win, boom, we win the gold. And what happens if they then walk off the court and they say essentially they're focused on the next problem? It'd be confusing. That's not an invitation to sort of something that has happened great. In medicine, we tend to always talk about the next problem, but we rarely go back to our communities and says, here's what your tax dollars have done. And by the way, here's what we could do if we even leveraged it even more, that we can get more people to actually have benefit. So I am a big proponent on the fact of the matter is that you have to point out what ain't working, but it would be also not great to say that nothing is working at all. We need to actually let people know that when we do have a signal, like for African Americans, that there was a gap in 20, if you look at 2010 or versus 2021, it was a almost a 30% gap between Black white deaths, in the early 2000s. That's been reduced down to 11%. But that's not zero. It's not to say that just because we made some progress don't mean we need to make more progress. And Doc, what I would tell you is that the problem isn't that we're not making progress, it's that progress is not always evenly distributed. And we need to call that out. When you now have a miracle molecule that becomes a miracle medicine and it can actually treat cancer X, that's great. We should all get excited. But we should be even more excited when everybody has access to that. And we can get more people who can actually be alive. So that's my life's mission.
Thank you, sir.